This past Monday here on BK Live, we discussed the mayor's executive budget, which leaves unanswered how billions of dollars in much-needed transit improvements will be funded. The MTA is preparing its capital plan through 2019, which will determine the future condition of everything from subway cars to drainage pumps and ventilation fans, as well as any improvements or expansion to the system, such as new subway routes or commuter railroad stations. It's a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. And there's no shortage of ideas on how to fix the MTA's finances and its quality. But so far, those in charge have made no commitments. Today, we're going to discuss the latest budget negotiations and how they might affect the city and its crucial transportation system. We want to welcome Jameson Daig, research associate at the Citizens Budget Commission and co-author of the report More Than Fair, as in F-A-R-E. And we also want to welcome Adam Foreman, research associate at the Center for an Urban Future. Welcome to you, Adam.
Thank you guys for being here.
Absolutely. So, as usual, I was cheating before we started and I got all passionate about this. But just for your average strap hanger, like all of us, get on this train or the bus every single day, how would you explain to a layperson like me exactly, well, not exactly, but give me a general idea of the MTA's financial state? Because it kind of just feels like they're always asking for more money, which translates to regular folk like me, you're going to want more money for my Metro card.
Right, so it costs about $14 billion a year to run the MTA. About half of that is for New York City Transit, a little less than a quarter is for the commuter railroads. But almost 20% of that is just to service the debt on capital investments that the MTA has made in the past. And so on a year-to-year basis, they're being funded through fares, they're being funded through general tax subsidies, and then also through cross-subsidies for motor vehicle users, whether that's through tolls or other types of user fees, such as a license fee or an auto registration, or even the gasoline tax.
Okay, so when we say capital, capital investments, like those are repairs, and like what should a layperson be looking for? Like, okay, they spent money to do what?
So part of it is bringing the system to a state of good repair. The subway and the whole MTA system, in fact, is very old, dating back to the early 1900s, late 1800s even. So some of it is just bringing the existing asset to a state of good repair. But it also includes expansions, things such as the creation of the Second Avenue subway, the recently introduced Penn Access project to bring Metro North stations and Metro North access to Penn Station, and then also East Side access, bringing the Long Island Railroad into the Grand Central Terminal.
Okay.
Adam, what's your take on this? Why is the MTA in such dire need of cash? I want to talk more about the debt you mentioned. Why is the MTA in such dire need of cash if it's always crowded and they keep upping the fares and things like that? That's what people want to know, right?
I think it's really expensive to run a subway system. So New York is actually very fortunate in that fares pay a large portion of operating costs, of day-to-day operating costs, about 70 to 80% for our subway system. Comparable systems, maybe 40%, so they need to be 60% subsidized. But that's just operations. You also have capital, which we're talking about. So that's state of good repair, replacing trains, replacing ventilation systems, but also expansions. Right now, over the next 5 years, we're looking at $32 billion in needs for the capital budget, and we've only funded about $17 billion. We have a $15 billion deficit. That's huge.
Does that make more fare hikes inevitable?
Yeah, that's what I want to know.
Possibly, right?
Possibly. They've been on a every 2-year sort of rolling basis of fare hikes, and I think that in order to keep the ratio that Adam mentioned, the idea of having fares cover 70 to 80% operating costs, you have to increase fares over time as the cost of the system increases. The magnitude of those fares, a lot of that will depend on what decision makers come up with when it comes to funding the MTA's capital plan.
And CBC actually did a great analysis on fares, and they were looking at fares versus Yankees tickets, fares versus slice of pizza versus a hot dog, and it's actually increased much less than those other prices. So people get frustrated every time a fare increase, but they actually haven't increased that significantly over the last couple of decades. The last couple of years have been significant, but in order to operate such a crucial piece of our infrastructure, the real lifeblood of the city, it costs a lot of money. So of course it's frustrating when fares increase, but it's also necessary.
I just feel like, again, the layperson, average person who doesn't, have the time or even the acumen to say, okay, well, like fares have gone up X, Yankees tickets have gone up X, and to kind of make those comparisons. But for us, it kind of just seems like every time we turn around, they're asking for more money. And then there is just kind of like a shroud of distrust over the MTA. That's putting it nicely, because they've been caught keeping 2 sets of books way back when, less than 10 years ago. People just don't trust them. And how do you make it more palatable for us? So now all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's a $14 billion, $15 billion deficit. And it always feels like this get 'em, got 'em thing, this scare tactic. Like, so what would happen if they don't get this $14 billion?
Well, I'm kind of take your question 2 different ways. As far as what would happen if the plan is not funded immediately, probably the Capital Plan Review Board, which is the state board that approves the MTA's capital plan, would likely approve the plan over its 5-year period as far as the size of the plan. However, they wouldn't necessarily get into how that's paid for. And so sort of the funding side of it would continue as is, sort of with this capital gap, funding gap in the future. But sort of getting back to your initial question, how do we ensure that the MTA is, good stewards of, taxpayer and fair payer resources? They've made some improvements in transparency, and we hope that they continue to do so. They've also implemented efficiencies that now amount to about $1.8 billion a year since the program started, or rather will amount to $1.8 billion per year in 2018. It's been growing over time. But I think it's important for groups like CBC, groups like Center for an Urban Future, to monitor what the MTA is doing and perhaps suggest ways that the system can operate more efficiently. It's vital to New York City and the greater region's economy, and making sure that it's there in the future is both a funding question but also an operations question.
And I think in some ways it's sometimes unfair, the criticism towards the MTA. When I was doing a report on on the MTA, someone said a quote. It said, "MTA operates a 1980s subway system, but with 21st century leadership." And I think that's absolutely true. We have fantastic leaders at the MTA. It's just very old infrastructure. People talk about the bad old days, and that's a very amorphous concept of maybe graffiti inside trains. But I think more concretely, there used to be there's something called the mean distance between failure, when a train would fail and would have to kind of go out of operation. About 1982, that was every 7,000 miles. Today, it's every 180,000 miles. So we're seeing an 1,800% increase in the operations of the subway system. Recently, in the last 2 years, that's actually gone down, which is troubling. And I think that speaks to what happens if we don't fund it. We can return to those, constant failures, constant derailments, and that's a real problem.
Yeah, you mentioned all the debt. You said half of it's billions of dollars worth of debt. What is the origin of that debt? Has the MTA always been in financial trouble? Has it gotten worse throughout the past decade is what I'm asking.
Well, there's sort of an important distinction here, which is that not all debt is bad debt. And when you pay for capital investments in your system, what you're saying is, let's borrow now, let's make the changes, the fixes or the expansions, and then have, the people in the future pay that back. But they're also the people using the system. So some debt is okay. The MTA's debt has grown significantly. Now it's up to about $34 billion. That's more than several countries when you think about it. It's several small countries. And they are limited in what they can borrow altogether, but they'll probably have to borrow more for this plan. And so they've been lucky in that they've been able to borrow at extremely low rates, but if that changes, it makes completing capital work and paying for it in the future very expensive, and how that is reflected either, whether it's in fares or other types of taxes and cross subsidies, will be important to see.
Okay, now both of your organizations have made suggestions for the MTA. Let's talk about some of those ideas. Let's start with you, Adam.
So one of the suggestions we spoke about, which should raise about $1.5 billion, would be the Move New York plan, which is fares on the East River bridges, the Brooklyn Bridge, Manhattan Bridge, Williamsburg Bridge. It originates with Sam Schwartz, a former traffic engineer at DOT, really exceptionally wise individual. And it would actually lower fares on bridges outside in the outer boroughs, but increase fares in between Manhattan and Brooklyn. I think it's kind of an exceptional way of raising money. I would also just make the areas around those bridges much safer. Less people would be using them, instead using the Verrazano Bridge, where, so more evenly distribute traffic around the city.
Jameson, what sort of ideas do you have for a better MTA?
Right. So the way that we look at it is most of the funding gap, rather than coming predominantly from fares or even general tax subsidies that business and individuals pay in the region, is looking at these motor vehicle cross subsidy, tolls being one of them. We looked at the Move New York plan, and it is very compelling as far as a way to raise money to support capital improvements.
Definitely not well received by the public, though. Like, we have to point that out because people cringed when they heard a fare on the Brooklyn Bridge. But just.
But the other side of that,
how would you make that attractive to an average person?
Well, what they've done with this latest iteration of the plan is they've lowered the tolls at other MTA bridges. So the idea would be that it isn't as expensive, or rather there's parity between crossing the Brooklyn Bridge or using, say, the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel.
Right.
So that is
Okay.
one way. They also, I believe they max the amount that you would have to pay to enter the central business district in any one day. So if you have to make multiple trips, there's a maximum level for that. So that is one thing that the CBC looked at in their report. Another type of motor vehicle cross subsidy that we think has a lot of potential is what's called a vehicle miles traveled fee or tax. And essentially it's a user fee based on the amount that you drive in your vehicle. And the benefit of this is that you're better matching the use of the roads versus how much you actually drive, as opposed to picking apart any one toll. And a VMT user fee can be very sophisticated. You can charge different rates based on the time of day or the area in which you're entering, which sort of allows you to sort of smooth out the amount of traffic congestion going on at any one time. And so there have been pilots in other countries and also in Oregon, which have been very promising as far as people's interest in a VMT, and so we would hope that moving forward, the governor would maybe look at that as a possible funding option.
Adam, are there any other suggestions out there floating around that you know of about making a better use of funding the infrastructure, or a better MTA?
I think another one is called value capture, which is probably most successfully done in London. So they have a new commuter rail called the Crossrail, and it was partially funded by new buildings that came up around the commuter rail. A portion of the revenue would have to go towards the construction of that new line. And it makes sense when you build new subway lines, that appreciates the value of real estate around the area. So the city or the MTA should benefit from that appreciation of real estate value. I think a really good opportunity would be the 2nd Avenue line. When you extend up to East Harlem, that's going to appreciate the value of real estate around the area. It's going to lead to a lot of new construction. A portion of that benefit should go towards funding the line.
That I agree with. That one I'm down with that one. Because when you were like Brooklyn Bridge, I was like, the city is so expensive, I can't take any more.
And it should be noted that the MTA and the city have already done that. So extending the 7 line to Hudson Yards, that's an example of a value capture. So the city is paying the debt in order to, or rather to service the debt on building that station. And then the increase in any sort of property tax revenues due to new builds there and more square footage, the MTA is sort of dedicating toward paying off that debt. So that's sort of a model of that. It's an example, maybe not a model.
I mean, to get into the weeds there, I would really call that value segregation rather than value capture. So basically, it's sales tax that's already happening, and they're saying this will only go to this line. It's not a new income stream, whereas London actually created a new income stream, a new tax on development, which would go to the line. And I think it can be more successful, and the 7 line has had some trouble.
Yeah, because as soon as you said that, I just saw another tax line on one of my receipts, so I'm glad that you clarified that for us.
Well,
So
I'm the one adding the new tax line. It's my fault.
Yeah, thank you both so much for joining us. No, this was enlightening because it kind of brought things a little bit more into perspective for me, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Please come back again in the future because we know it's an ongoing conversation.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job.